I'm going to talk to a little bit drier topic, which is about regulatory affairs. But I hope I can still get you some enthusiasm around it, because it is about actually what was a leading element for the Mobilise-D project. I'm hoping to share with you the journey that we went through as a consortium, outline the key achievements that we've made, and also some of the lessons learned, obviously, that we've touched upon. If we take a step back as to what the original project was about, it was about two things, right? It was about identifying and validating a specific set of DMOs that can be used as a reliable quantification for mobility performance. Basically making sure we're connecting the digital mobility assessment to clinical outcomes. And yes, we've already heard a lot about the technical validation, about the clinical validation of that. But we did it with another purpose in mind as well, and that's to make sure we're getting endorsement from the health authorities. Because if we don't use that as an external endorsement of what we are doing, we're not able to make sure that we can implement these as potential endpoints in clinical trials and getting recognition that this is actually a useful tool to use. And so I will not dwell on the slide, but when we're talking about mobility, and particularly the disability, loss of having limitations in walking, there were three aspects that we defined. And as part of the regulatory process, we obviously had to make sure we were talking the same language. So the whole consortium has contributed to how do we establish the various terms, some that are already out there, already in the public domain, but others we actually had to kind of really crystallize ourselves. And we are focused really on the mobility performance. So not about perception, which you would measure, what one can do, not about capacity, which you can do when you're being supervised and in a particular setting are observed for maybe 6 minutes of walking. No, you're trying to do what actually happens in the real world on a long-term period, over a long-term period, and how people just operate in their daily lives. We want to establish then those digital mobility outcomes and hope that they can be then selected to be utilized for endpoints that we can then help to monitor mobility in clinical trials. So if we look at the context of use, that drives all of that, where we have to be very specific as to what it is that we want to measure. And that's where, again, definitions become a very important aspect, because we will want to talk the same language and make sure that when we're presenting that to the external environment, to health authorities and the public at large, that we have the same set of language and terms. So obviously the Mobilise-D consortium had to express a context of use paragraph that we wanted to explain, and it's listed here, and we have already talked about it previously, and that we then wanted to propose Mobilise-D digital mobility outcomes that would either be disease-specific, and in the 4 disease areas that we talked about, complementing those that are already in use, and perhaps hopefully can indeed lead to additional benefits, but also hopefully with the kind of the blue sky thinking of, can we find some DMOs that are actually disease independent and work across a number of disease areas. So we proposed that we would avoid pre-selecting these DMOs, but rather use the validation process to identify which one would work best for each diseases. And so this was at the outset, right? So we've now already talked about how we managed to get there and how we have harvested some of the fruits of that hard labor. But we had to establish that beforehand, and we had to talk to health authorities about what our plans were and how and whether they would be buying into that and actually have maybe some recommendations as to how you would want to do that differently or augment the process. And we also talked about, of course, about the clinical validation study. And we would then use those DMOs that are accurate enough to detect the minimally clinically important difference. So the definitions are listed here. I'm not going to go through them, but obviously as part of being a regulatory affairs professional, we try to be specific, and I'll have you in the handouts to make sure you can read that at your leisure. Then we reached out to the health authorities. First and foremost, we went to European Medicines Agency, and we actually established 2 qualification advice rounds. The one was going for disease-specific DMOs and targeting one particular disease, namely Parkinson's disease. That was on the basis of also informal feedback we've had in discussions with health authority members to make sure that what we were planning to do, and we were trying to, almost like eat an elephant, but we had to cut it up in short pieces to make sure we can digest that. That obviously was not a single call or a single meeting. That requires a lot of effort from a lot of people across the consortium, many phone calls and letters being written and emails being considered, Zoom meetings, etc., all leading to getting to that particular qualification advice meeting with a briefing book and capturing the feedback. That first qualification advice resulted in a letter of support published by the EMA, and that is actually on the link. If you were to look after the session, you can access these slide decks, and those are publicly available. The second qualification advice, which we entered upon quite quickly thereafter, was started in June of 2020, and we then spread out the target towards having multiple contexts of use, working for disease-specific DMOs in the various disease areas that we targeted, and as well brought up the topic of what if a DMO would work across diseases and basically be disease independent. So that also resulted in a letter of support, which we gladly received, and we obviously took on board those recommendations. If you want to look at the detailed description of all the feedback that we received and how we went through both those advice procedures, that's nicely contained in Professor Visconti's publication that we all contributed to. There are 2 elements, one covering the first part and the other one is on the second qualification advice, plus the strategy that we then pursued afterwards. So if I summarize the advice that we got from EMA, is that great news, the technical validation plan was approved. Also the general design of the clinical validation plan was accepted. And there was a question around, can you describe, can you really show how meaningful the mobility performance for patients is? And we heard a lot about that just now as to why that is so important. So we hope we have addressed that part, which was kind of given to us early on in the process. Another last element, and clearly a very important feedback from the EMA, was that the ability to detect change would not be able to be deduced from the observational clinical study, but that it also needs to have a demonstration of treatment effects in randomized clinical trials. And that's the part that we still need to embark upon. But that was very valuable information to get from the EMA and know what it is, what it takes to get to qualification of these endpoints. So if I concentrate on the briefing book number 2, and I've listed the questions on the left, but I'm not going to read them out. I will just resort to the main conclusions that we draw from that briefing book. The EMA agreed that the distinction between mobility performance, capacity, and perception, so the definitions, they agreed on that mobility performance could be very valuable, provide valuable additional information in the 4 diseases of interest, that important to establish the MCID, and that an observational multi-center study can help to identify the most appropriate DMO per disease, and that EMA support the overall clinical validation concept. There was also feedback, and that's listed at the bottom of that, is that monitoring mobility performance in the real-world settings really does provide an additional dimension of mobility. And that in addition to the other 2 concepts of mobility perception and mobility capacity, the performance is a very valuable tool. The discussion also revealed that it remains unclear as to how these dimensions of mobility is perceived as most important by patient and healthcare professionals. And that was the part that the previous speakers have all covered so nicely. So if we then draw upon the second advice and how we have digested that, I would like to again point out the publication that's listed here, and that we had summarized these feedbacks into two articles that are publicly available in addition to the letters of support that we've received from the European Medicines Agency. So with that, we refined our qualification strategy, and we basically went forward with the plan as you have now seen, and actually resulting in results. So, and I would draw on the last paragraph here, just to, in space of time, but again, it's kind of useful to have all the aspects that were covered listed out here, is that if the clinical validation was successful, then those DMOs can be positioned as secondary endpoints in marketing authorization applications for new drugs. And that would then help to support additional label claims in the product prescribing information. Then we embarked on also approaching FDA. There was a little bit more a time lag in that part. The pandemic did not help with that, because FDA was at that point closed for regular business, and only the most urgent of things could be capitalized. So entering into scientific advice procedures was a challenge. But what we did have was in October of 2021, we had an informal meeting, a phone call, a teleconference with the FDA process around drug development tools. And they confirmed to us that it would qualify as a clinical outcome assessment in their terms, and that we would need to submit a letter of intent, an LOI, for each of those indications. Mobility should be correlated to a patient's daily activities, and the information on what patients are actually doing would be very important to interpret the data. Collecting these data about what patients and caregivers consider important is essential. So again, here you hear the resonance of the talk we just heard, and also the feedback that EMA gave at that point. The rationale for which diseases we were covering, and also how any new DMOs would complement the existing endpoints, would need to be thoroughly explained. So then we embarked upon submitting a letter of intent and having a pre-letter of intent meeting with FDA, which is part of this drug development tool process, in May 2023, and we selected one particular disease, multiple sclerosis. On the feedback, and that was a very helpful and very constructive discussion, FDA indicated that it considers actually our project to be in a relatively advanced stage. And so part of the process that FDA goes through is, well, they have to select from a range of topics, one or two that they can really contribute to. And they felt that at this point in time, they could not give that much additional feedback, but insisted that if you provide look at the process that it is, what would be the right point in that process that we could embark and reach out to them again. So we've taken pause on that particular aspect of the strategy, and we will consider further FDA engagement once we actually have the clinical validation results available. So next steps is indeed looking to approach both EMA and FDA to seek their feedback on the results that we have generated, and gauge what aspects should be implemented in the design of future randomized clinical trials when you are doing drug development. So we could also look at how we could then support future teams that would approach these agencies with their randomized clinical trial protocols, where we can perhaps provide a model protocol for that sub-element of implementing these digital tools that would support digital endpoints. This obviously, as we looked at the time point, probably will happen beyond the formal closure of the Mobilise-D project. And once we have that, we can then pursue a qualification opinion with that, which is basically providing all the data and giving the rationale with evidence about which DMOs are suitable for drug development and getting both health authorities, particularly EMA at first, but also with FDA, would like to get their blessing that these DMOs can be utilized in drug development. So lesson learned, I think overall it's an iterative process. We embarked upon making sure we had one disease area in particular covered, and then how we could move into other diseases and perhaps across diseases that could benefit from that. A difficulty and a challenge always remains how to get the various health authority inputs and coordinate them and make sure that they can be easily merged. As we set out, we were hoping that we could do it in a more parallel session, but that was actually, as part of also the pandemic, was not easily to be implemented. In terms of preparation phase, I think we capitalized on early interactions with the EMA in particular to align the requirements for global project implementation and to really seek multiple advice meetings where that is feasible. It's really important to state on upfront what the concept of interest should be, and it should be relevant and should be clinically meaningful. And the context of use, you need to be very specific to crystallize that, to make sure you have a clear topic to discuss with health authorities and help the regulatory assessment of that. Utilizing checklists and publicly available feedback, obviously the DMD experience was very helpful as we were setting up this, and it is important to continuously look at what is available out there. In the procedure phase, yes, long lead times, the various stages are a part where you have to go through a process of application and review. And after the procedure, I think we found it very, very helpful to receive those support letters from the Scientific Advice Working Party. They help to publicize our progress, but it's also important to publish these experiences in science publications. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. I would want to give special thanks to my co-leads that were there, Marco Visaconti and Giorgio Davico from the University of Bologna. Giorgio is going to speak after me. Gula Demley helped me greatly with parts of the FDA interactions. Previously also, Sabina Hernandez and Leen van Steenbergen were also helpful in the EMA activities. And of course, all the regulatory work package colleagues to that. So with that, I would like to hand over to Giorgio. Thank you.